Welcome to Chapter 4. In this chapter, we're going to talk about managing marketing information and marketing research. Many large multinational global companies conduct an enormous amount of research so that they can better understand the motivations and behaviors around their consumers and how consumers purchase and engage with their products. Smaller companies obviously have a lot harder time doing good quality, insightful market research, but we're going to discuss that in much more detail throughout this chapter. Market research is all about gathering relevant market information to help marketers make the best possible decisions for their organization. It includes things like what customers' needs and what motivates them in terms of buying. Those things can be very, very difficult to determine. It's easy to understand what people buy. It's much, much more difficult to understand why people purchase the things that they do. Good marketing information is required by companies to help them ensure that they're attracting the right customers and providing them with the ultimate value in terms of what they're offering to consumers. Usually, marketing information is generated in huge quantities, especially today with the help of information technology and online sources. But the challenge, of course, is just because you have lots of really just because you have lots of data doesn't mean that data is good data, and doesn't mean that companies know what to do with that data to help them make decisions. You might have heard the term big data before. We hear it a lot in the media. People talk about big data, and it really just refers to the enormous amount of data that is collected about us as individuals every single day, very often without our knowledge or without our informed consent. So every time you engage with social media, every time you swipe a loyalty card, every time you type in a website or search or go to a website or search something, there's data being collected about you. And the amount of data that is now available to companies is astronomical. And that's what was referred to as big data. The challenge, of course, is in terms of what companies do with this data, how it's collected, and if it's collected ethically, and then how do you use that data to make better informed decisions for your organization in a way that doesn't exploit or manipulate consumers in an unfair or unethical manner. The main purpose of market research is to gain insight into your consumers, to help you as a company better understand who your consumers are, what they value, what they need, how they make decisions, why they make decisions, etc., etc. And this sounds like it might be easy to do. It really isn't, and we're going to spend the bulk of this chapter going over the various ways you can gather or find marketing information, market research that might help you make decisions for your consumers. Marketing information systems, MIS, which is different than management information systems, although they're very, very similar, consist of the various people and procedures that are put in place to enable decision makers to access information, to develop the information that they need, and to help decision makers use that information to generate good, actionable, validated decisions regarding their consumers and their marketing strategies. If you look at this visual in sort of the middle, I guess, two rectangles, it's important for marketers to be able to access important information to help them make decisions. And they do that through internal databases, information that you already have within your organization. They do that through other forms of marketing intelligence, which we're going to cover in just a few minutes. And they do that through their own market research, conducting their own research. And they, at the end of the day, they use all this information, they analyze the data, they use that information to make decisions. Good marketing information systems try to balance the information that marketers would like to have obviously marketers would like to have as much information as humanly possible, and they try to balance that against what they actually need in order to make good decisions and what is feasible to offer given the resources the company has to devote to the gathering of marketing information. So the money, the existing data, the expertise that they can put into actually gathering that information. Things like obtaining, analyzing, storing, and delivering information is extremely expensive. That's why in the very first example in the slideshow, it showed, global multinational large corporations like Procter and Gamble, like Coca-Cola, like Walmart, like Disney. They have lots of resources that they can devote or invest into gathering the marketing information that they need to make good decisions. But for smaller companies that don't have access to those deep pockets or those rich resources, it's a lot harder. So companies have to decide whether the value of the information that they might be able to get through marketing information systems and through market research is actually worth the cost of it at the end of the day. There are three main sources of information or places where marketers can go to gather information that they could then use to make good decisions. And we're going to spend the next few slides talking about these in more detail. But you can actually look at the data that your company already has in-house. So looking at internal databases. So if you're either a small company or a really large company, you probably have some data that you've collected about your business activities that might shed some light into consumer behavior. So you could check your internal databases to see if you have existing data already at your fingertips that you can access. You can also develop some competitive marketing intelligence. So taking a look at information that exists but exists outside of your organization that you may want to avail yourself of and delve into to see if there's any insights within that information that might help you make decisions. And then, of course, you can conduct your own market research, either by doing it in-house, like your marketing experts conducting the research themselves, or hiring a third-party consulting group, for example, to develop some information for you to conduct your market research. Internal databases are the easiest and very often the quickest way for you to access information. Internal databases are the collections of consumer and marketing information that you as the company already have within your normal business operating procedures. So for example, there's a number of ways that Starbucks already has a wealth of information about consumers at their fingertips just through their regular everyday operations. If you're a consumer that has a loyalty card or a gold card like I have, or if you're a consumer that uses the Starbucks app, every time you swipe your card or scan your app, Starbucks is able to capture information about you, and they collate that information at the store level, at the regional level, at the national level, and at the sort of corporate level, and they can do some really interesting analysis where they can learn a lot of things about their consumers through that data. But in addition to the loyalty cards, for example, or the apps, just the cash registers that they use at Starbucks and other types of retail establishments actually have a wealth of information that's collected within those systems. It can track what kinds of beverages people are buying, the average price or price per transaction. It can track what time of day consumers are coming into the store. It can track whether you're you go in the store or whether you go through the drive-through. It can track how long the drive-through takes. So there's a wealth of information just captured by companies through the everyday transactions that can provide really, really valuable insights to marketers in the organization. Competitive marketing intelligence are those systematic processes that allow you to monitor, collect, and analyze various types of information about your consumers, about your competitors, and about the overall marketing environment in which you compete. It could include things like observing your customers firsthand. So if you're in at Starbucks, you may gather data by observing, do customers stay and sit in the cafe? If so, how long do they stay? And are they by themselves? Are they with other people? Are they working on their laptop and using our Wi-Fi? Are they reading a book? Looking at what people are doing just through observation. You can actually quiz the organization's own employees and see if you can gather insights into consumers or marketing activities based on the perceptions of employees. You can compare what other competitors are doing and do a comparison. So, um, you could, for example, if you want to know how long Starbucks drive-through is compared to Tim Hortons drive-through, well, you can actually go send people out, time how long it takes you to get through the drive-through, and you can gather information by comparing your own performance against that of the competition. You can conduct some online research. So we've all seen them, surveys that come out through social media, for example, where you can ask some questions and gather information that way. And also, you can monitor your social media platforms and run analytics on those platforms to help you better understand the online activity that your consumers are engaging in that might help you make better informed consumer decisions. Some of the things that competitive marketing intelligence can do for your organization: it can offer insights into consumer opinions, not just about your own products, but about products in your general product category or other brands in your product category. It can provide early warnings of competitor strategies and potential competitive strengths and weaknesses, so we can raise some red flags for the organization with respect to what the competitors are doing. It can help firms to protect their own information, but it can raise some important ethical concerns, and we'll talk a little bit more about ethics later in this video lecture. Finally, market research is the systematic design, collection, analysis, and reporting of data that's relevant to a particular marketing situation facing an organization. There are three broad approaches to conducting market research. You can actually conduct your own market research. You can have people who work for your company, particularly in your research department, conduct market research for you. The one caution I would say here is that conducting good market research requires a very high level of skill and expertise, and a lot of smaller organizations simply wouldn't have that kind of expertise within their organization. But certainly large organizations like the Coca-Colas, Nikes, Starbucks of the world, they certainly would have access to those expertise within their own organizations. You can also hire outside research specialists. So go to a consulting firm that has experience and expertise in the area of conducting market research. Pay them a very hefty fee, and they will conduct the market research specifically for you for your own needs. And the third way of conducting market research is to purchase existing data that already exists in the somewhere outside the organization, purchase that and use it for your own purposes. It's called secondary data, and we're going to talk a little bit about what secondary data means in just a few moments. There are four main steps to the marketing research process. The first is to define the problem and what your research objectives are. It's really important to know why you're pursuing market research. What question are you trying to find an answer to? What problem are you trying to solve? That will ultimately guide everything else that you do with respect to market research. So it's really important to understand exactly what the problem is that you're trying to resolve and what your objectives are with this entire research process. The next step is developing the research plan for how you're going to collect information. Where are you going to get the data, and how are you going to get the data to help you answer those questions that you defined in the first step of the process. The third step is to implement your research plan, to actually go out and collect the data and then analyze the data using advanced statistical analysis, which are things that we're not really going to cover in any detail in this class, other than to say that there's a whole field of marketing that's dedicated to analyzing marketing data. And then the last step of the market research process is to interpret and report the findings to those people who need that information to make decisions. The first step in the market research process is to define the problem and your research objectives. And you absolutely must do this at the very beginning, because the decisions that you make around what problem you're trying to solve through your research and what your research objectives are will determine whether or not you are to use exploratory research, descriptive research, or causal research. Each of these different research approaches is very different and is used to resolve or help you achieve very specific research objectives. So it's really, really important that you give due consideration to your research problem, because that will guide you in terms of the kind of research that you're ultimately going to do, how you're going to actually solve those problems. Exploratory research is used to gather preliminary information. It's really intended to help you define problems that you might have or think you might have in your organization, and it might help suggest some hypotheses or some potential solutions. This is really sort of a very preliminary, early type of market research that you might want to do if you really don't have a good handle on what's going on in your organization, or don't really have a good handle on who your customers are and your relationship with those customers. Descriptive research is used to better describe the market potential for a product or the demographics of your consumers and the attitudes of your consumers. This is probably among the most common type of market research that is done. It's relatively straightforward to do, and it can provide really important insights on who exactly your customers are. The last kind of research is causal research. It's not casual research, and it's always funny to me when I'm marking exams how many students write casual research, but it's actually causal research. Causal research is used to test hypotheses around cause and effect in terms of relationships, how two different variables are actually connected or related. So, for example, you may say, well, what would happen to the amount of orange juice that we sell if we raise the price by 25%? That's a cause, raising the price by 25%. And the effect is, what impact does that have on the sale of orange juice? And so when you want to understand the relationship between those two variables, price and volume sold, you would use causal research. Once you have a clear understanding of the research problem that you're trying to tackle with your research, then you want to develop a plan on how you're actually going to address the question that you asked, or the problem that you're trying to resolve. The first thing to do, of course, is to outline any sources of existing data that you already have access to. So take a look. If you know what the problem is, the first thing to do is, of course, look within the organization to see if there's information you already have on hand that would help you answer those particular research questions. The research plan will help you spell out the research approaches that you're going to use, your contact method if you're going to be collecting data, your sampling plan, and the instruments that you're going to use to gather the data. Now, we're going to go into more detail, a little bit more detail on all of these in the next few slides, but I don't actually expect you to understand sampling plans and complicated data analysis. I just want you to understand that these are components of the overall market research process. When you develop a market research plan, you may actually have to prepare a written proposal, a written description of your research plan. If you do, these are some of the major components of what a research plan would contain. Again, you would reiterate your research problems and your research objectives, which is step one of the research process. You would determine what information you need to obtain. What information or data are you looking for? How are the results of the research going to help you make decisions or help marketers make decisions? How much is the research going to cost? And very often that's a significant consideration when you're developing a research plan. If money was no object, there's all kinds of research projects that many companies would want to undertake. But the reality is, every company, even the giant companies, have limited resources that they can devote to market research. So it's important to understand the costs associated with that research and the type of data that's required. Those are just some of the things that might be included in a written research proposal that you're putting forward to your organization. Before you ever embark on collecting your own data, it's really important to understand and to consider whether or not secondary data already exists that will help you answer your question. So secondary data is information or data that already exists. It was collected for another purpose, either by the company or by another party outside the organization. But the information exists, and you may be able to access that information, sometimes for a fee, and it will help you answer the research questions that you're trying to address. So you don't, just because you have a research question you want to answer, doesn't mean you have to go out and collect new data. Very often, the data may already exist in the company's internal databases. Perhaps the data can be purchased from outside suppliers. So for example, maybe there's a consultancy firm that did some research and they have data that might be relevant to help you answer your question. Or maybe there's an industry association that that collects data that might be relevant to help you answer your research question. So there may be data out there that you often have to pay for, but sometimes that, even though there's a cost to that data, it still may be less expensive than actually doing your own research. You can do internet searches and maybe find access to information that is relevant to helping you answer your research questions just online. Some of the advantages of using secondary data is that it can be lower cost. It doesn't mean it's inexpensive or cheap, but it could cost substantially less than if you were to conduct your own market research. So it tends to be lower cost than doing your own projects. It can often be attained relatively quickly. If the data exists, certainly if it's within your own organization or held with an organization that you have ready access to, you can actually get this data fairly quickly rather than taking the time it would require to do a full-fledged research project. And it also may enable you to access data that otherwise you would not be able to access. You know, small companies that have limited resources are not going to be able to do wide, broad scale research projects. So accessing secondary data may actually enable you to have access to information that you would otherwise not be able to get. Some of the disadvantages, though, is that the data may be irrelevant to your particular research problem that you're trying to address. It may be close, but it may not be exactly what you're looking for. It also may be inaccurate. Remember, this data was collected for a different purpose by people outside your organization, and you don't have necessarily any control over the integrity of the data. The data might be too old. If it was collected 5 years or 10 years ago, it may not be relevant to your situation today. And there may be inherent biases in the data that maybe weren't relevant for the original purpose of the data, but may actually be relevant for your purposes. And so secondary data is not perfect by any means, but often it's good enough that it will do the trick for you. So it's that phrase, good enough. Often secondary data will meet the needs of organizations when it comes to marketing information. The opposite of secondary data is primary data. Primary data is collected for you and for your specific research purposes or your research objectives. So this is not data that existed previously. This is data that was collected for you, by you, or by a third party on your behalf for the specific purposes of addressing your research questions. There's a whole bunch of different approaches to primary data collection, and we're going to talk about those in more detail. But they include observation surveying, which is the most common, or experiments. There's different contact methods or ways you can collect data. There's different sampling plans, and again, I don't expect any students to understand what we mean really by sampling or the various sampling options, other than to say that you need to give consideration to who it is that you survey and what research instruments you're going to use. So we'll talk about those for the next few slides. There are three broad research approaches that will help you conduct primary research to help you answer your research questions. The first is observational research. This research involves gathering primary data by observing relevant people, actions, and situations. You could be observing them. You could have a human being who is observing other people and recording what they observe. You can actually also do observational research using digital observation. So, for example, you could collect information from cash registers or scantrons or etc. Those are a form of observational research where you're gathering primary data by observing how people behave. You're just collecting it digitally. The most common type of data collection, or the one that many of us would be most familiar with, is survey research. This is where you ask people questions about their knowledge, their attitudes, their preferences, and their behaviors, and people will answer these questions, and that's your source of data. You can conduct survey research in person, over the phone, by mail, or online, and there's advantages and disadvantages to each of those different uh, uh, data collection methods, but survey research is by far the most common and the most familiar to most people. And the last type of research approach is experimental research, where you have a controlled setting and you conduct experiments on people in a controlled environment. It's very difficult to do, it's very expensive to do, and it's hard to control all the various factors that might influence people's behavior. But there are times when experimental research can actually provide really meaningful marketing insights. So let's just take a minute and talk about surveying and the different ways you can conduct surveys, because it is the most common type of research approach. You can mail questionnaires using old-fashioned Canada Post. You can mail questionnaires to a large number of people. The cost per respondent is relatively low, but of course the problem with mailed questionnaires is the return rate. The majority of people who receive these questionnaires in the mail actually won't respond to those questionnaires, and so there's a lot of wastage when it comes to mail surveying. Telephone surveys are another option where you can do telephone interviews to gather information relatively quickly. Telephone surveys provide a little bit of flexibility because you can tailor the questions you asked based on the previous responses from the respondents' previous responses. But again, many of us have a very negative view of telemarketers, people who call us at home asking us to do surveys, and so it can be effective, but also can be quite time consuming and expensive because of the human resources involved in conducting phone interviews. In-person interviews is another form of data collection, so doing individual one-on-one surveys or interviews, or doing it in groups, like focus groups, for example. Again, very effective way of gathering really, really good quality information, but very, very time consuming and very expensive to do this, because obviously there's a human resource cost to conducting in-person interviews. It should be no surprise that online surveys are growing in popularity. While they are not free, and I want to dispel that myth right now, online surveying can actually be a relatively cost-effective way of collecting a large amount of data relatively quickly and relatively easily. So you can do things like internet surveys, where you invite people to complete your questionnaire, through various online portals. You can do online focus groups where you actually have either video conferences or some sort of mechanism where you get a small group of people together to have discussions that are aimed at addressing your research questions. You can actually do some web-based experiments and play around with different variables to see how people respond online. And of course, you can track consumers' behavior online through sort of observational techniques, but in an online format. So it's no surprise that online marketing research is growing in popularity. It's relatively more cost effective. It's definitely not cheap and it's certainly not free, but it can be relatively more cost effective. And just it's a great way to capture relevant information to help you answer your market research questions. Companies are increasingly tracking our online behavior to see what it is we're doing online and how that information they can glean important information from that activity to help them make decisions. So online listening doesn't always necessarily mean hearing, but scanning what people are saying about your brand and your competitors' brands online, often through social media, but not always through social media. So, what are people saying about your products? And there's a wealth of tools that are actually pretty easy for an average person to use that will help you gather this information relatively easily. They're getting to the point where it's actually almost, excuse me, idiot proof in terms of being able to what they call scrape that information from online resources and then ultimately analyze that to help you gather marketing insights. You can track people's online behavior and in terms of how they respond to different advertisements and marketing offers that are delivered to them through online portals. So you can target people that way. And you can also analyze people's social media behavior and see if you can find various connections between your customers and the other types of activities that your customers may be engaging with online. I'll give you a great example. Several years ago, we had the social media manager for the Cavendish Beach Music Festival into our class to talk to us, and she was telling us how they do excuse me, an enormous amount of research using social media to learn more about the people who go to the CBMF concerts every summer. And so they do fairly complicated, but at the same time, relatively accessible analysis of people's online social media activity. And what they found in one instance several years ago was that people who enjoy the CBMF concert series tended to also enjoy cooking. And then you may think, well, how are these two things related? And I don't really understand how they're related, but that's what the data told the social media manager. The social media manager was then able to use that information to pitch to Paderno, the PEI company that makes cookware, and tell them that actually being a sponsor of the Cavendish Beach Music Festival was actually a really good fit because many of the people who attend that concert series also happen to enjoy cooking. And so they were able to use the data that they gleaned from, scraping their social media platforms to make a pitch to a potential sponsor in a way that really provided value to that sponsor. So your sampling plan is all about who you're going to target to get the information that you're looking for. So a sample is a segment of the overall population that is selected to represent the population as a whole. So it's almost impossible to survey everyone. The only exception to that would be a census that governments tend to do. But typically, market researchers don't try to gather information from everybody. They take a small segment of the general population that they want to focus on, and they study them, and they assume the small segment of the population, the sample, represents an approximation of the population as a whole. There's three main decisions that you need to think about when you're designing your sampling plan. your sampling unit. Who are the people that you want to study? Who are they? What are their general characteristics that they have in common? What is the sample size? How many of these people do I need to study in order to get the most valid results possible? If you study, you don't need to study millions of people. Actually, studying several thousand is often sufficient to get you good information that you can then generalize to a much, much broader population. But there are some statistical tools that you can use to help you figure out exactly how many people you need to study to get fairly valid results. And your sampling procedure, which is the method of choosing the people that you're going to study. So once you know who they are and how many you need to talk to, how are you going to find them? So those things are really important to consider in your sampling plan. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here other than to say there's a variety of different kinds of sampling plans that market researchers can consider. All of them have benefits and drawbacks. You can just read through them very carefully. You do not need to understand these in any great length, other than to understand there is more than one way you can develop a sampling plan, and it's important to recognize and refer to the experts when deciding which is the sampling plan that makes the most sense for your organization, for your research objectives, and for the resources that you have available to you. The next is the market research instruments, the various questionnaires that you can administer in person, by phone, by email, or online. They can have closed-ended questions where people just check the box, or they can have open-ended questions where people have to provide a spontaneous answer to those questions. And you can also gather information using mechanical instruments. So it could be a counter at the door that tracks how many people come through your business. Checkout scanners, for example, are an incredibly important mechanical instrument that will help you gather data. And increasingly, marketers are turning to neuromarketing, the science of the brain, to gather information. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. Increasingly, marketers are using very, very sophisticated methods, neuroscience, to determine how people's brains respond to various stimuli. So in some cases, it really means putting electrodes on people's heads and tracking their brain waves when they're exposed to various marketing stimuli. We're not going to spend any more time talking about this in this class, but we do talk about it a lot more in brand management and in consumer behavior, which are fourth-year marketing classes, because increasingly we're seeing market researchers use this kind of advanced neuroscience to better understand people's intellectual and emotional reactions to marketing messages and how those things impact their consumer behavior. So once you have your research plan in place, the next step of the market research process is to actually implement that plan. Go actually out there and collect the data. Process the data, checking for accuracy, fixing any problems that might arise, coding the data for analysis, and then ultimately analyzing the data using statistical measures. These are steps that require a great deal of expertise, especially the analysis of the data. And so it shouldn't be left to people who don't have the requisite educational and experiential backgrounds to do a good job. Otherwise, everything you've done so far will just be wasted. It's not enough just to collect data. It's really important to then do something with that data to help marketers in your organization make decisions. The responsibility of the market researcher is to interpret the findings. So what does all this data mean to us? What does it tell us? To draw conclusions and to report those findings to the decision makers in the organization, because very often the people who conduct the market research are not the same people who need the information that is gleaned from that research to make the decision. So it's important to open a line of communication between the researcher and management so that the data can be used to make decisions. The responsibility of the managers is to work closely with the researchers when interpreting the results to make sure that they understand those results and can use them to make informed decisions, and to share the responsibility for the research process and resulting decisions. So they are an active part of the research process, even though they may not be the ones conducting or leading the research. Today, there are a variety of tools that will help marketing managers manage those all important customer relationships. These systems that are put in place help manage information about individual consumers. So again, think of those loyalty cards or swipe cards that that increasingly companies are using to better understand their customers. Carefully managing all the various customer touch points to ultimately maximize customer loyalty is the goal of customer relationship management. These kinds of things consist of software and tools that integrate consumer information from all possible sources, that analyze the data in depth and apply the results to help increase that customer loyalty. So again, every time you swipe your card or engage on social media or in some way interact with a brand, they're capturing data about you. And there's people behind the scenes and systems behind the scenes that are analyzing that data and then sending out, very often in real time, tailor-made marketing communications or incentives to ultimately cultivate that important customer relationship with consumers. We're not going to spend any time really talking about big data and marketing analytics, other than to say, because companies have more and more and more access to big data through various tools and technologies and processes where companies are collecting data about consumers, there's an increasing demand for people with the skill set and expertise to analyze that data, provide meaningful insights to organizations to help them make better decisions. So that's the only thing I want to say about marketing analytics at this point. This is a topic that we cover in much more detail in sort of fourth year market research class. Other than to say, this is a growing and incredibly important and potentially really lucrative area of marketing that represents a real opportunity for students who might be interested in this side of marketing. Marketing information has no value unless it is used. It must move from the place in the organization where this information is collected, and it must move in a meaningful way into the hands of decision makers in a way that they can use that information to make decisions. And so the systems, internal systems, marketing information systems like intranets and extranets, or communication channels within an organization are really critical to make sure that this vital information that you invested quite heavily in, paid a lot of money for, gets into the hands of the people who actually need it to make decisions. It's not just big businesses that can find value in market research and that are doing market research. Small businesses and not-for-profit organizations are also embarking on more market research related activities. They do this by using secondary data collection. They use this through observations and their own surveys and experiments, usually on a much smaller scale than, say, multinational global companies, but they're doing it relative to their own business and their own organization's needs and resources. The responsibility of managers in these small business and not-for-profit organizations is to, of course, think very carefully about the research objectives, to formulate the fundamental research questions in advance, to recognize the biases that are potentially introduced by smaller samples and potentially less skilled resources, again, just based on the resources available to a smaller organization or a not-for-profit organization, and of course to conduct the research systematically using integrity-based research practices. Those are the responsibilities of managers in small organizations and small businesses. Marketing research just doesn't happen in your domestic market, sort of within Canada or within North America. A lot of marketing research happens across borders, and that can present some really interesting and unique challenges, including things like dealing with diverse markets. The way consumers behave in Canada may actually be very, very different than the way consumers behave, say, in Japan or in South Africa or in Russia. And so it's very important that you don't necessarily assume that the results that come from research based in one region of the world are applicable to situations elsewhere in the world. Finding good secondary data in foreign markets may be a challenge because part of the process of using secondary data is, of course, to evaluate the quality of that data. So that may be more difficult in a foreign market compared to your domestic market. Developing good sample strategies may be more challenging in international markets than in domestic markets, and reaching respondents and getting people to participate in your market research may be more challenging. And then, of course, just handling differences in things like culture or language or attitudes towards market research may be important factors that you want to consider when conducting international market research. The cost of research in general is high. The cost of international research is even higher, but the cost of not doing it is even higher than that. So the risk of making decisions without really good information far outweighs the cost of actually investing in the research process. While market research is really important for organizations, there's an increasing sense of concern among many consumers and consumer advocacy groups around intrusions on consumer privacy. So the failure to address privacy issues can often result in angry and less cooperative customers and ultimately increased government intervention. Some of the best approaches for researchers to take when considering customer privacy is asking only for information that is needed, using the information responsibly to ultimately provide customer value, and avoid sharing information without consumers' consent and permission. It's really important that good ethical standards be built into the research process, and there are actually, certainly in academic fields, but even in professional, non-academic fields, there are standards of ethical behavior that good market researchers will follow to help minimize, to the extent possible, any unnecessary intrusions on consumer privacy. Years ago, Target came under increased and quite intense public scrutiny when they invaded a customer's privacy. They had developed an algorithm to determine when a customer, an online customer, was pregnant, and it wasn't necessarily tied to, did the customer search for pregnancy tests online or whatever. That wasn't part of it, but they developed a fairly complicated algorithm to determine whether somebody was expecting a baby. And so this individual went on to Target's website and was searching for various products, and Target's algorithm made the decision that this person was very likely to be pregnant and sent this customer some coupons and some information about pregnancy in the mail. Well, it turns out this customer was a teenager. She was in fact pregnant, but had not yet told her parents that she was pregnant, and the resulting invasion of privacy and disclosure of her pregnancy through their marketing tactics were very, very heavily criticized in the media. And this example is used as a prime example where the mining of data can actually infringe on people's right to privacy. Finally, it's really important, again, to build in ethics into the research process to make sure that the entire research process, including the collection, analysis, and use of information derived from that research, is done so with the highest level of integrity. And again, there are codes of research ethics and standards that market researchers can and should be held accountable to, and companies must ultimately take responsibility to protect customers' best interests and their own best interest by ensuring that the research that is conducted on behalf of the organization meets those incredibly high standards.